Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the one detention a month, where rather than having a lovely bowl session with our guests, we actually inflict some learning upon you. Today, Molly and I are going to talk about a 2012 study in the Journal of Science and Medicine in Sport. Doesn't that sound like very reliable? Titled Rating of perceived exertion during cycling is associated with subsequent running economy in triathletes. The study examined different methods of measuring effort during a triathlon simulation and then tracked athlete run economy off the bike.
So we're excited about this study partially because it is another validation point for RPE being more than just an emotional metric, which feel like sometimes it's perceived as. This study suggests that RPE is actually a really great way to measure your effort, and if you use it, you might find yourself running better off the bike.
Awesome. Um, okay, this study. First of all, we gotta quickly slay a dragon. Uh, in the triathlon and endurance world about what's the difference between running efficiency and running economy.
Tell us, word lover Chris.
Yeah, speaking of differences, Molly and I had a fun back and forth about like what's the usefulness of just this kind of definition stuff, which I think is super useful in its own right. But so you'll see these like terms bandied around a lot in the endurance world, where economy and efficiency are basically used interchangeably. We're going to kind of speed through it. It will probably help with your understanding of the study, and it will certainly help you be like the annoying person at a triathlete party. So hang on to it for that reason. So economy is the different amounts of fuel that is consumed at different levels of effort or speeds. So like when you drive your car faster, you burn more fuel. When you run faster, you consume more oxygen. If you improve your running economy, maybe that would be you run faster over time, but you use the same amount of oxygen. So like a month ago, you could run 7 minutes per mile when you're consuming X amount of oxygen. And a month later, at the same kind of consumption, you run 6 minutes and 50 seconds per mile. So you've gotten more economical. Um, Efficiency is, oh, and then so for like the car analogy, which is where everybody usually goes for this, if you drive your car faster, you burn more fuel. You are less economical at 60 miles an hour than you are at 40 miles an hour. Efficiency is the ratio of energy that actually gets applied to the task at hand versus the amount of energy lost to the surroundings. A car with like the highest fuel economy out there is still like a wildly inefficient machine. It loses at best, it loses 70% of the available energy in your gasoline to the environment. So running efficiency is actually kind of hard to measure. It's a lot easier to do it on the bike, but running economy is relatively easy to measure and use. And that's the thing that this study is really looking at today, is that measuring triathletes running economy both from a non-fatigued state and then in a fatigue state of running off of the bike, which I'm guessing is pertinent to most of our audience. Okay, so why the hell are we here, Molly? What happens when triathletes run off the bike?
Well, unfortunately, a whole lot of messes happen. So, as triathletes, we have the unique privilege, fun, challenge to get to the run last. By the time we get there, we have already been swimming, we have already been riding our bikes, and a number of biomechanical and neuromuscular and physiological changes happen because of the time that we spend on the bike, and especially because of the time that we spend in time trial position. Although it would happen in any position. Biking and running are just really different. Running has been researched before, and there's been a lot of cool research that said that running off the bike, even recreational triathletes saw greater peak angles for anterior pelvic tilt, an increase in hip flexion and spine extension, and a decrease in hip extension across all of the time points that they were studied in their runs off the bike. So if you have ever been towards the end of a race, or if you've seen some of your like finish line pictures, I know that I have seen some finish line pictures where it's just been really clear what that like anterior pelvic tilt and increase in hip flexion and spine extension really looks like. And that is for most people, like their pelvis starts to kind of spill forward and their tailbone starts to come up, and it's a real bummer for race pictures, obviously, where you don't feel like you're looking as strong as you would like to. But it's also a good setup for injury. And I think that that is something that many of us as triathletes, many of us in the sport have dealt with before. We see a lot of run injuries show up that aren't necessarily related just to the run. They come from the combined double whammy of bike to run transition.
So okay, like a bunch of stuff there, like anterior pelvic tilt, increased hip flexion. What's increased hip flexion? Like what is that like? What's a real world like depiction of that? What do we see when we see increased hip flexion?
So what we're trying to avoid in hip flexion is that kind of like Ironman shuffle of like your leg not being drawn forward, of just kind of a short stride and a fast turnover that isn't necessarily going to make you economical on the run. Counter to that, though, we see like elite marathoners who are super economical. We were talking before we got started in this that like, my first idea of an example for a really economical runner was like, what about like those super explosive, powerful sprinters, like the people who are going to win the 200-meter sprint. But in reality, they don't have to be that economical. They can afford to lose a whole lot of energy and to leave a lot of energy out there because they only have to get from point A to point B very quickly. There have been some cool studies on swim sprinters, and they've done them versus like the college varsity football team. And over very, very short amounts of time, the varsity football team actually generates more momentum in the water. But because their hydrodynamics are so poor and because they are not economical, they get slowed down infinitely more, exponentially more than the swim sprinters do, even though the swim sprinters aren't necessarily stronger or more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, like keeping it in like the swim world, and especially with sprinters, right? Like because we deal with this when we're trying to coach swimmers to be more effective open water swimmers, and we get those athletes that like kick too much, and they've seen like swimmers in the Olympics, and they're like, look at those guys, like they're kicking really hard, and we're like, well, yeah, like they can afford it because like. Like their time budget is so short.
Right, exactly. And for us, if we are like very high aerobic flutter kicks are typically not very economical. They tend to burn a lot of our fuel, our human gas, our VO2. They really dip into those stores. And so they're not meant for very long distances. So if you can slow that down, if you can integrate maybe a 2-beat kick or some kind of some slightly more economical power for your leg section, then you should be in a lot better position to start the bike.
I like leg section.
For your leg section. That's right. It was like for your rear portion? No, that's not right.
For my own words.
Caffeination is key today.
There's like one person that's going to get that Homestar reference. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe the sample size is small.
It's true.
Yeah. So like, basically one of the things that we're here for is like, if we can improve run economy in triathletes, we're going to improve your performance. Like that's like the one big thing that like kind of I think jumped out at both of us is this is like a path to that. Is like, oh, if there's a way that we can improve run economy in our athletes running off the bike, you're just going to do better, because you are going to literally be spending less oxygen at the same level of effort.
Exactly. And what's lucky is that there are some really, there are some validated and accepted ways of measuring run economy and changes in run economy. So we can actually look at studies and see, what causes a bigger change in run economy, which is exactly what this study is.
Nice. That was such a good setup right there.
Oh, thank you.
That was a good one.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're so this should surprise none of you out there. We're actually not going to even talk about the study until like part 3 of our sort of like of going through all of this. But one of the things that we really felt like we wanted to do was take a pit stop here and talk about studies, how they can be interpreted or misinterpreted.
Yeah.
I think all of you guys out there know that that I went to advanced poetry school, but Molly, you actually spent your education like using studies, examining them, getting familiar with them, and sort of being really like native in that area. So could you like take a few minutes and take us through like what is a study and what makes a good one?
Yeah, absolutely. So caveat, I am now just about 8 years out of my master's program, which was in public health, and I mostly looked at adolescent health and reproductive health. Also looked at eventually what I ended up doing when I got out of public health school was a lot of epidemiology. So some of the work that I've done has been focused on infectious disease prevention. I did some very gross coronavirus work, or not coronavirus. Sorry, I did do a little bit, but I did some very gross norovirus work that I'm always happy to talk about. But it's been a little bit, and I might be a little bit rusty. So if people have questions, feel free to drop them into chat. But I love study design. Study design is the thing that I was most surprised about in master's in public health school. It was I love it because it helps you get to the truth, and a well-designed study should do exactly that. It should help you to answer your question, to test your hypothesis. It should help you to remove bias, which is incredibly important, which we're going to talk about in just a second. And it should hopefully, and if it isn't, then you need to get a different IRB, but it should hopefully be ethical. It should let you do this in a way that tests your hypothesis and gets you to an answer in a way that does not do harm to the population that you're working with. And there are some reasons why, like, that idea about ethics has led to a lot of the variable applicability. That's right. Of some of the studies that we have right now. If you've read Roar, then you've seen that a lot of studies are performed mostly on men. A lot of that is because of fears about ethics for working with women. It's not just because women are different from men in a lot of ways, although they certainly are different from men in a lot of ways. There's also a lot of fear about reproductive cycles and interfering with that. And there's been historical fears about working with women. So we are underrepresented in a lot of scientific evidence. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And we are actually underrepresented a little in the one that we are about to discuss. So we look at bias and what percentage or what a proportion of bias shows up in a study. There are lots of different ways that bias can get introduced. I'm going to talk about a couple of them really quickly because they're ones that we're really prone to. Confirmation bias is my favorite, that we will see what we are looking for. And I think that Chris and I certainly bring a little bit of that to this study. We are very interested in the effect of RPE and the usefulness of RPE, and so it's not surprising that we were drawn to a study that studied and found RPE to be effective. So that's certainly some bias. There's also sampling bias, where the sample doesn't necessarily represent the population. You really want the sample to be representative of the group that you're working with, and we'll talk about that with this study in a little bit too. But in general, bias just relates to some of the systemic sources of error that you need to consider when you're looking at the results of any study. It is also a way that we introduce confounding into studies. Confounding is my other favorite thing in study design, and confounding is when the effects of the exposure that you're studying are given outcomes. Yeah, so the effect of the exposure is altered by the effect of an additional factor. So a way to talk about that more clearly is to give some really fun examples. Because what it does is it distorts the relationship. And this is where that phrase of correlation does not equal causation comes in. So one example for this was the inclusion of helmets in World War I kits as soldiers were shipping out. And they realized that after helmets started to be included in the standard issue kits that were given to people, that the proportion of head injuries started to go up. And so if you look at that just on a correlation standpoint, like head injuries are caused by helmets, because the more helmets you have, the more head injuries you have. But really, it was because the helmets were protecting people's heads, so they were having head injuries instead of being killed in battles. Other much more entertaining examples include that ice cream trucks are correlated with muggings, and one of the number one causes of global warming is a lack of pirates. As the number of pirates have gone down, global warming has continued to rise. So if you really care about global warming, you should consider becoming a pirate.
I am shipping out tomorrow.
Yep, that's right. That's right.
That is where, yeah, and insert Chris thinking that pirates here is like peg legs and parrots.
Yeah.
It's not.
Oh.
Yeah, no. It's
it's more of the like.
This is like a Red Sea pirates.
Oh no, I was thinking it was like Blackbeard. Well, okay.
Yeah, no. In this case, I think that might actually even be a correlation and causation loop inside of the even grander loop there.
Yeah, that's probably true. True.
Chris and Molly's understandings of pirates correlates correctly. Somebody fill in the blank.
There must be an answer there.
Like hurricanes that start with the letter O.
Things that we don't understand. So in general, you get these studies and you get these results that a lot of conclusions can be drawn if you don't look at the reasons why things were caused. And in some cases that is accidental. In some cases that bias just hasn't been identified. But in some cases, especially when science is tied to things like marketing, and product promotion and all of that kind of stuff, which it certainly is in our sport, to coaching. In fact, a lot of things that sound like science are actually not. A lot of things that sound like they have been, peer reviewed and researched, don't really have a very strong body of evidence. That strong body of evidence is their marketing technique. And I think we see this a lot with coaches who are new to the sport, especially, and have had some success with their own training, trying to then extrapolate that N of one to a number of athletes that they work with who probably have a very different, set of circumstances that are leading them to their performance in the sport. And in many cases, that is covered up by the one beautiful truth of endurance training, which is that if you do something, you're probably going to get better at it. But if you want specific improvements, and if you want to target some of the more specific, if you have goals that are more specific, you want to work with better research and better data and better science.
What's N of one? What does that mean?
That means only one person was involved, or one thing was studied. It's a case study. An N of one is a case study, and case studies can be really effective, but they really should not be extrapolated to population level conclusions.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the issues with this particular study, right? It's not an N of one, but what's our limitation here?
It's a sampling size. It's an N of 18. And there's some issues within that N as well. There are 13 men and 5 women who are involved in this study. There are also there's some commonalities about them, I think. They tend to be very young. They tend to be quite fit. Yeah, I think that the average age was 21 for the athletes that were studied here, and they made a point in the study of saying that they were not elite athletes. But I put a note somewhere in this document that was like, maybe not elite, but also not like Molly. Like it's they're very powerful athletes in general. They may not be racing at the top of their game, but they are not unlikely winning their age group.
So yeah, let's actually, so it's 21 minutes into the show. We probably we're at least somewhere between 50% or 30%, 33% of our show today. We are finally arriving at the actual study description. So yeah, Molly, tell us about who was involved in this study. And yeah, you just gave us some of the details of it, but yeah, what was, yeah, take us through what they did.
So I'm gonna kick the first day of the testing to you, but just another note on this one. This is a cross sectional study, so they're looking only at one population. There's no like case control going on here. They are their own controls, so they're testing athletes' performance against athletes' performance with an intervention, and in this case, the intervention was a bike. So they're studying how they're looking to answer how athletes' economy changes when they run off the bike versus when they run just in an open run. So the way they designed this involved 2 test days. They do not tell us how far apart those days were, which is something that annoyed both Molly and Chris. But Chris, what did day 1 look like?
Okay, day one. Day one actually doesn't sound too bad. So the first thing they did two run tests on day one. First, they did a run test to establish what an athlete's run economy, how much oxygen they were using at a particular intensity. For this, they just picked 12 kilometers an hour. It's 8 minutes and 3 seconds per mile. So all of the subjects in the study did a 5-minute warm up, and then they did 4 minutes running at that particular pace. In the last minute, they took 2 30-second samples, getting how much oxygen was consumed at that particular pace. So they're just getting a baseline of what each subject's economy at that particular pace was. So test number 1, really not too bad. Test number 2, VO2 max test on a treadmill. These are not fun if anybody has done these before. Your nose gets clipped shut, so you can't lose any gas through your nose. You got one of these big breathing masks on, and you are doing increasing intensity every minute to one of my favorite terms in exercise science, volitional failure.
That's right.
What's volitional failure, Molly?
I can show you.
I don't know if we have the time.
Failure.
Yeah, it's when they decided to give up. It's when they decided that enough is enough, and begged the nearby lab tech to please stop the test. Yeah.
I think they stand on the side of the treadmill.
and then throw up into the face mask.
That's right. I think the next endurance school T-shirt is going to be "There's always time for volitional failure."
Oh, it's marvelous. We have got to write these down.
I know.
And so the reason why they needed the VO2 max test, they used it for a bunch of information, but they needed to know what that baseline economy was vis-a-vis each individual subject VO2 max. So say one athlete, I'm just going to use easy numbers here. Her VO2 max was 60, and at that 8 minutes per mile pace, she was consuming, 45 milliliters of oxygen per minute. So that's that's how they kind of figured it out. So like, oh, okay, at that particular intensity, this athlete is like 75% economical. I am making numbers up right now, so they are mostly there for just elucidating what they did. They also needed this VO2 max number because they used it to extrapolate to the bike on day 2, which Molly is going to tell us about now.
So day two, they started off with a 45-minute bike session, hilariously designed to represent an Olympic distance bike race, draft legal. I don't know about you, but I'm certainly completing my Olympic distance bike race in 45 minutes. That included a 15-minute step up that was starting at 100 watts for 5 minutes, and then 150, and then 200 watts. And then they did intervals of 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 10 minutes. Wait, 2, 2, 4, 10, and then 4. Yes, and then another 4-minute interval, and everything got a 2-minute recovery. They were all pretty high intensity, and they measured the VO2 of athletes as they ran off the. So then they completed another run off the bike, and they studied those athletes' economies. They collected a number of data points during the time on the bike, though, including RPE for the entire session, and then RPE for the last minute of the last interval. So that last 4-minute interval, that last 1 minute of that. And then they tried to compare the run economy of athletes on day 2 with the run economy of the same athletes with themselves on day 1. So they were their own case controls, essentially.
And what were they like? What was the goal here? Like, what were they trying to find out?
They were trying to find out if athletes lose run economy lose run economy running when they're running off the bike, or essentially what happens to athlete run economy when they run off the bike, and what of the measures that they were collecting and the data points that they were collecting correlate to a gain or a loss in economy on the run. And they did actually find that it affected athletes differently, not surprisingly. They ended up dividing the athletes into groups of those who had impaired run economy after the bike, those who had no change in run economy after the bike, and those who actually had improved run economy off of the bike. And that was the study. That was our study, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, so what did they measure? Like, what are the things that they measured while they were? I mean, I know they measured a lot of stuff, but we're probably going to hit maybe the top 4 or 5 of them. Yeah, what was the data that they were collecting on the bike?
So they were collecting power in watts, percentage of peak power, power in as watts per kilogram, so expressed as power to weight ratio, heart rate, percent of heart rate max, RPE, blood lactate accumulation, and percent of peak lactate.
All right, that's a lot.
Yeah.
What are we? Let's chop that down a little bit, because some of them, like, I think we're not really going to touch like percentage of peak lactate at the moment.
Yeah.
But what jumps out at you from these from the results diagram here?
So one of the big things that jumped out at me was that the perceived effort between these groups was not tremendously different. It ranged between for the whole session. It ranged between 13.6 for the group that showed improved run economy up to 15.3, and this is a scale. This is the Borg scale, so between 6 and 20. Up to 15.3 for the group that showed an impaired run economy. But if you think to yourself, like, go out and bike at a 13.5 out of 10 versus a 15.5 out of 10, that's not a huge difference. Like, there's a difference there, but that could be a difference in me in my performance over the course of one race. Like, there could definitely be moments of 13.5 versus 15.5 in the same half Ironman. And then as we look at that last 1 minute of that last interval that they did, that starts to get wider. It goes from 14.2% for the group that showed improved run economy up to 17.2% for the group that showed impaired run economy. So still not a giant difference, but a little bit of a larger spread there. What does that imply about the group that was being tested, Chris?
It implies a lot of things. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff. I think the big implication that we took away from it was that the athletes, from sort of looking at the numbers, the athletes who ended up with improved run economy, we were pretty comfortable saying that they were fitter.
Mm-hmm.
Like, looking at the numbers, we were like, okay, because basically looking at the heart rate effect versus the watts per kilogram effect, um, we were like, okay, these athletes in the improved run economy are fitter. So that's point number one in terms of like the stuff that Chris and Molly usually like to establish about running effectively off the bike. The thing that will make you the best, one of the factors that will improve your running off the bike is to get as fit as you can on the bike. So the bike takes less out of you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the big implications that we took away from the athletes in the study. Um, I think one of the ones, and this goes hand in hand with the improved run economy athletes being fitter, is the athletes in the impaired group were working a whole lot harder. And the Borg scale, it's a funny scale. It's weird. It goes from 6 to 20. 6 is like just walking around. 20 is like a completely maximal effort for whatever distance you're contesting. Um, Usually around 17 is where the Borg scale gets associated with athletes that are describing threshold. So there's ventilatory threshold. They start gasping. They describe it as very hard, that kind of thing. So the athletes that were impaired were finishing their race in not great shape. They were struggling. They were working really hard. They were gasping, and the athletes in the improved group were actually pretty fine, like a 14 out of 20 on the Borg scale. I think that if you were using our standard 1 to 10, it would probably be anywhere from like a 5 to a 6, depending on the athlete.
That sounds right.
Somewhere in that range,
Mm-hmm.
like moderate to moderate hard, but certainly not gasping and like exhibiting kind of thresholdy behavior. I think one of the reasons that like we like this so much is that there is this prevailing myth about triathlon that you should ride harder at the end of the bike. And that is basically wagging the dog instead of wagging the tail. Like, what the reason that athletes who finish stronger than they began do well is because they started easy enough to build the effort as they went. And I think they're never going to be in that place where they're absolutely coming unglued at the end of the bike. So that was those were the sort of implications that I took from there in terms of the athletes.
Mm-hmm.
What's our big big takeaway that we want to inflict upon all of our audience?
The big result, the big finding of this study, which is I actually think is huge. So kind of regardless of everything that went into the study design, what ended up happening was that a group of like pretty fit athletes ended up working at different intensities and saw different results as they ran off the bike. And the biggest thing that they found is that of the cycling intensity variables, so everything that they were monitoring, the only thing that was found to be statistically significant when it's associated with the change in run economy was the last minute of the last interval on the bike, that 1 minute of RPE. That 1 minute, apparently, the RPE during that minute accounts for 33% of the variation in run economy when it's compared to the run-only conditions. So 33% of that change seems to be found within that 1 minute of RPE, which I think is huge. Like, whether that's because it was, they were bigger people at a smaller wattage or, fitter people working over a longer period of time, no matter what accounted for that change in perceived effort, that perceived effort was big enough to cause them to run with significantly greater economy as they ran off the bike compared to their counterparts, which I think is amazing. That's incredible.
Yeah. And like, so I think the big, like, one sentence takeaway here, is this: so higher RPE values are going to be associated with impaired running economy.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to take one thing from this whole 45 minutes, it's that. We just got a question in chat that, like, okay, so good. This is good. This is kind of what we anticipated. Sadly,
No coasting.
yeah, like, the way to make this applicable to your racing is not to just coast into transition and say that it was a 2 out of 10. That's kind of missing the point. Like, in the same way that we were just talking about, like, that athletes who build their power throughout the bike ride tend to do better in a triathlon on the run. Well, it's not because of some magical feature of more watts in the second half. It's because you started easy enough to, like, not bury yourself. You were riding within yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than just coasting into transition, sadly, this is still a long form change. What we want to do is that we want to train you so that in that last minute that you're getting off the bike, you're at an acceptable level of perceived exertion for the distance that you have chosen. The only way we get there is through training. Specific training that effectively prepares you for the race. And if you do that correctly, then you are going to be coasting into transition at that, in this case, the 14 out of 20, or, in our parlance, sort of whatever it is that Molly and I have kind of talked with you about, of, like, what's the acceptable RPE at the end of the bike ride.
And I think that is a good segue. And yes, Kirby, we know that was a softball. You would never coast into triathlon. You would never. So I think that that's a really good segue, though, into what are the training and racing applications of this? Like, what does this look like when we see it in real life? And I will give you a spoiler. We probably saw a lot of it over the weekend. Yeah.
I'm hoping that most of you have spoilers, spoilers coming up in the next minute of talking. Yeah, that those final minutes of the PTO championship on Sunday, you were probably seeing quite a lot of impaired run economy in all of those athletes that are, the best in the world at this. Mm-hmm. They're really good at what they do. Let's not take away anything from that in that regard. But I think that none of you can look at a bunch of those athletes in the second half of that run and tell me that it's, like, great run form.
Some of them you really can. Some of them did an amazing job, and some of them clearly biked their hearts out. And then tried very, very hard to keep up in the run, and tried to, some of them I'm certain had an RPE that was probably not correlated to improved run economy. It was probably correlated to saddened run economy.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the problem with this particular sample size. Mm-hmm. Some of these athletes, they are going to achieve, quick speeds in spite of their run economy, because they can kind of brute force it with the amount of oxygen that they can run through the system. And it sure looked like a lot of brute forcing, particularly on the men's side.
Particularly in many of the top 10.
I think on the women's side, we got an absolutely amazing look at what perfect run economy looks like, from both Paula Finley and Annie Haug. Annie Haug maybe is the, like, 100th percentile to Paula's, like, 97th. But if you want a good picture of what great run economy looks like in triathlon, just go watch Annie Haug. I mean, that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, Kirby, I think Sam was certainly one of the one of the people who kind of showed the field what his bike could do, and then had to kind of hang on to the repercussions of that. And again, an incredibly talented athlete at the top of his game or near the top of his game. Somebody who certainly can get away with more than the average bear can get away with, and had a great race, and was so fun to watch. But yeah, certainly I think even has admitted in the last 24 hours, like, yeah, I did what I had to do. Like, had to catch the rest of the crew. Like, yeah, that's a good visual though of what it can do to your run economy.
And I mean, it's such a great comparison. And like Kirby just brought up Brownlee. Like, I think it would be interesting to look at. It would be great to get the perceived exertions for all of the men at the front of the group who tried to ride with Magnus Detlev when he came through. Most of them really didn't have any business doing that. Their fitness was not preparing them to ride with an athlete of that ability to put out power on a flat, perfectly paved bike course. Like that athlete is designed to go fast in that particular context. And so like Brownlee trying to stay with him, like textbook example of like a good way to blow up. Sam was probably in a better shape chasing through because he's not responding to something that he can't do. Sam's a great cyclist. He can ride through the group. I'm sure it hurt him still.
I bet it did.
but it didn't hurt him as much as Detlev.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
is kind of okay. So we're gonna kick it over to questions in a few minutes. But so what's another? What are some other applications to our training? Like what can we take from this and actually give people like something to take and apply to their own work?
So one of the things that I have been, and I know you've been sort of focused on this year, is the idea of like, what is FTP, and what does it mean to people? How do we use it, and what does it truly represent? And I think that what it actually represents and what it means to people are very different things. And I think that what this research sets up for us is a pretty good idea of what can happen when you let like those vanity metrics really get a hold of you. And I think that some people, a lot of people think that their FTP defines their ability as a cyclist, and that carries a lot of weight with it. That I've had athletes tell me that their FTP is wrong on like when we would operate out of C-Velo, like when we would use like different machines that nobody's taking home with them, not your familiar, not your power meter that's on your bike. That number may well be very different just because of measurement error. Like we can expect up to a 10% difference from power meter to power meter, depending on the type of power meter and reliability and all that stuff. If you are focused on the number instead of the experience and the training effect, it gets really dicey. So like, Chris, we were talking a little bit earlier about, you've had several FTPs this year. Like, do you know what your FTP is right now?
I could give you a range that I would be surprised if it was outside of like a 30-watt range, but I would also, I don't think I would hazard a guess any more specific than that. I would say that it could be right now as low as 340 and as high as 370. Is kind of what I would be willing to go out on a limb and say. So
it within about 8%.
Yeah, and I think that's about as accurate as it's gonna be.
Certainly at this point in the season.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because I think that it's so, like we struggle with this, just like you said, at like C-Velo and place like that, where athletes want the number to be gospel for a whole bunch of different reasons. Like sometimes, yeah, it's like a vanity number, it's an ego number. Sometimes it's a real desire to like get it right,
and to have assurance.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Like to be like, I want to know that the work I'm doing is effective. Um, but I think that this is one of the great takeaways from this study is that what's the answer then to that athlete who's like, I really want to know the exact number so I can like look at my power meter and like hit that number exactly every time, Molly. It's the only way that things are going to work.
Training at FTP doesn't do that much for you. Like, even if you knew that one number, like, if you spent a bunch of time at FTP, like, you're much better off knowing about where it is and staying well below it, or knowing about where it is and getting much above it. So, like the amount of time, and then even if you wanted, like, when you do need time for threshold training, which is sometimes, like, then get close, like get about there, and you're going to have the same training effect. It's going to
Yeah.
be, and it'll be better for you. And frankly, you're better going off of RP anyway, because your FTP on a given day may be different from when you measured it. Like, yeah. So what happens then for those athletes that want assurance when they, like, let's say that Johnny, triathlete, went to a cycling class. He did a ramp test, and he got an FTP of 350. And I'm just going to put out here that, like, this is a 60-watt gain from his previous FTP. So Johnny is pumped. Yeah. He puts
Yeah,
it on
Johnny's stoked.
Facebook, like, it's on Instagram, like, all of that stuff. Like, he's super pumped about it. And then he goes out and he does 70.3 Chattanooga. And he decides to aim for like 90% of FTP, thinking like he's pretty well trained. He's going to go in and he's going to do his 70.3 at 90% of FTP. And Johnny ends up walking the run. What happened there, Chris? He had all the right numbers.
It's true. Yeah, I know. He just, clearly, clearly it was the dew point was like just out of control that day.
That's right.
And, but no. Okay, so ramp tests. um, we have even prescribed ramp tests in the past. We have done that. And it can be done, but uh, there's a lot of problems with them. They are going to, if you have like a strong anaerobic contribution to your cycling, it's going to overestimate your FTP. If the steps are too short, you're particularly going to fall into that trap. Because those anaerobic athletes are going to get this like amazing contribution. They're going to be done with their test in like 7 or 8 minutes, and Johnny is stoked. The other problem is that the steps can be too long, and if the steps are too long, the athlete gets tired, and we never actually see like a true VO2 max kind of show up. So there's two different ways that it can be really problematic. 20 minutes minus 5% tends to overestimate FTP. 8 minutes minus 10% tends to overestimate FTP. There are lots and lots of tests. There's a whole bunch of different ways of doing it. I can tell you that like the thing that we're sort of eventually gravitating to is having people go out and ride at a moderately hard to hard effort until they can't anymore. And be like, great, like that's awesome. You went that long at that intensity and then you had to slow down. That's your FTP. Like, and I think that what we would really want people to take from it is what it felt like. That like for most of it, they would be like, oh, it was doable. And then it got really hard and I couldn't keep going.
And I guarantee that Johnny's like 70.3 race where he dropped, or where he walked that run, like he knows at that point, like when he gets out on the bike, even though all of the numbers are lining up, if he is listening to his effort is much too high.
Yeah.
And that is where, like, that's where those long posts about the, food was wrong and all that stuff. All of the excuses about what went wrong, when like in reality what went wrong is you rode too hard. And the sad thing is that you rode too hard based off of what you thought was the best data that you had. And what we are here to tell you and hope that you are getting is that you are your best gauge of how hard you're supposed to be riding. So you are in charge of your data, and that's the place to be.
I think one of the implications of this study also is, and this would be hard to track, but this is a guess, but that when you are obsessively trying to hit a number, it is stressful, and stress goes in to that RPE thing that you're experiencing. If any of you have ever had the experience where you were like, oh, like for whatever reason, I like wasn't looking at my watch, like, and I ran so well. That's because you're not experiencing that self-imposed stress of like, I gotta hit the number, I gotta hit the number, I gotta hit the number. I would guess that some of the athletes in this study who were in the impaired run economy group, a little unfit, a little obsessed with the particular number, and super stressed out when they're finishing up the bike leg, versus like the improved run economy group who apparently are sailing into transition, like smiling, like waving, like chilling.
High fives.
Yeah, high fives, waltzing through transition without a care in the world. And I really think that like part of your perceived exertion is the self-imposed stress that you are doing to yourself.
I had a very like surprising face to face with this on a run recently. As Chris knows, I have been dealing with a little bit of a shameful glute strain, which happens every time I forget to do my PT for a couple weeks, for a few months at a time. I'm not sure how long it was. But if you blow off PT and then you also don't do run activation exercises and you have a history of glute medius imbalances, then you will strain the one that is weak. That seems to be the truth. So anyway, I've been rehabbing it, and I did a bunch of easy runs, and I decided I was going to do some effort on a run that I had a couple weeks ago. And instead of aiming for pace, I decided I was only going to run as hard as my glute would let me and that I still felt light. And I looked down at my watch and I was like, not only 10 seconds per mile faster than the targets, but my heart rate was in a zone lower. Like, that is economy. Like,
Yeah, right.
I was running faster at a lower heart rate zone because I wasn't like muscling my way into a faster pace. And that was yet another teachable moment brought to you by my own
For all of us.
inefficiencies. brought to you by Molly battling her way through running.
Yeah. I mean, most of this is based on, I mean, like, hopefully something that I think will stand us in good stead is that we try to lean into the mistakes that we make as athletes as teachable moments, versus like the coach that you were talking about earlier that leans only into their successes and then imposes that way of thinking upon their athletes.
Right. I think the end of one can be a teachable moment, but it can't be a methodology. You can't say like, just because this has worked for me, it will work for you. Like, Chris Bagg, I'm going to train you exactly the way I've trained myself. It's not going to turn out well.
No, it'll turn out well for you.
Right, totally. Your bike is going to really suffer.
And I think our last application here is a call to sort of back up the lens. So like, you know, one way that you can be assured that you're doing this is, you know, I mean, still take your bike computer on your rides, maybe tape it over. You know, we still want that data, but if you are able to, over the course of your training cycles, achieve your kind of like test, rehearsal, whatever word you use for those workouts that approximate the stress of your coming event, if you are able to do those with steadily lessening RPE numbers, you're going to do this. You're going to achieve what's happened in this study, and you are probably going to be getting off the bike and running with greater economy. As every Australian knows, swim and bike for show, run for dough. And it is always better to be running effectively than it was to be. I mean, it's great to swim and bike effectively, but not at the cost of your run.
I think that's a good place to wrap this up. I'm actually a little surprised. I thought this was going to take us like 20 minutes to get through, and Chris was like, watch us talk. So proved again. We can.
I was like, we will be lucky if we get out of here in 45 minutes.
We can talk about RPE forever.
Sure can.
Thank you guys so much for coming for this, though. This is just awesome. It's great to have a chance to kind of sort through some of the stuff that we're thinking about, and to share it with you all who are the reason why we do what we do. The N of one, when it's us, gets boring sometimes. So it's really great to have such an awesome community to work with. So thank you guys for being here, and make sure you come back and join us tomorrow for Yoga with Amy VT, live on Twitch at 7:30 in the morning. And then Thursday, group ride, 6:30 a.m. Get up early, eat your Twinkies? No, Wheaties?
Wheaties.
Eat your Wheaties. Don't eat your Twinkies. Not for breakfast.
Especially.
Not a breakfast. Not the mummified one.
Don't eat that one.
Yeah. Anything I'm forgetting, Chris? Anything that
we've got endurance spin on Saturday.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so come on back here Saturday morning, 8 a.m. We'll put up the invite after we conclude Thursday's Zwift ride. Otherwise, everybody's going to get confused.
We're like, what's happening?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Next Tuesday, the final detention of the year. We are going out with a bang with Simon Marshall of one of our favorite books, Calm the F Down and Rise to the Occasion.
That's right.
The Brave Athlete.
The Brave Athlete.
Simon is pretty amazing. He wrote the book with Leslie Patterson of Xterra fame, and it's a wonderful book. Molly and I forced all of the other CBCG coaches to read it. So mark your calendars, next Tuesday, 5 p.m., right back here in detention.
Until then, guys, we will see you tomorrow morning. Yeah, thanks for everything. Thanks for all your cheers. Thanks for all your support. And we'll see you guys soon. Bye.